Back with us, Democratic strategist, former Obama administration alum, Roger Fisk, and of course, Marshall Kosloff. He's host of the Realignment podcast, a great podcast, which I also host.
And so, you do say so yourself. Yeah. Great to have you guys.
Good to see you guys.
All right, so I wanted to get both of your take on the relationship between the support for the Black Lives Matter movement and the Biden candidacy, and in particular, look at the RNC. They went very hard on this law and order messaging. If you elect Joe Biden, then these mobs are going to come into your city. They're going to come into your neighborhood and your suburbs. Of course, we've seen violence on the streets of Kenosha this very week, although those protests seem to have turned peaceful since then. So let's start the conversation with this analysis from Perry Bacon Jr. over at 538, asking the question, could a backlash hurt Biden against the Black Lives Matter movement? So far, Marshall, according to the data, as the Black Lives Movement popularity has declined, it has not seemed to hurt Biden's campaign thus far. That doesn't mean that things can't change. What do you make of all these dynamics, Marshall?
Yeah, several things. One, I don't think it's necessarily going to hurt Biden's campaign in the sense that if you look at that article, it talks about how BLM has basically just gotten back to where it was in May. All of the gains have sort of disappeared. But what it does do is it hurts BLM. Because sort of the problem here, what you sort of see has happened is that BLM, which at its best, and the sort of the version of BLM that I support, which is all about like obviously the idea that like black people in America have a different experience than white people, and that has to be recognized. That's a great idea. And I think that's where when you saw the protests in May, the gains came from. But the more then that BLM is thought of as a democratic thing, the more it's seen as a political movement, the more it's going to get hyperpolarized. So obviously, if we live in an era where everything is defined by 40% of the electorate is with the Republicans, 40 is with Democrats, and there's this mushy middle in between, any movement that leans into a political framing that either is Republican or Democratic is going to lose its viability in terms of its ability to sort of gains and make changes here. So I think that's a sort of depressing long-term part.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And Roger, I wanted to point to you to something that actually Jonathan Chait, not a fan of the show, but a fun guy nonetheless. Let's throw his tweet up there on the screen. It says, Democrats need to be extremely concerned about what's happening in Wisconsin, where support for BLM has gone from plus 25 to 0 in 2 months. And I actually looked at the crosstabs on that polling. That zero net positivity is actually before what happened in Kenosha. That seems to have woken up a lot of the people on the Democratic side. Roger, what do you think just regards with all of this and how it might impact the election?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. I think in the 538 piece, they also said that there hasn't been any polling done since the Kenosha incident.
Yeah,
so I would imagine that's
probably
underway, as we speak. I agree with a decent amount of what Marshall said. I subscribe to the idea that these things are kind of conical in the sense of like, as you get closer to election day, things are just kind of forced into that magnetic field. And it can be everything from like, has the pothole in front of my house been repaired, on through these larger kind of more national atmospheric issues. As a practitioner, the BLM movement is at a very interesting point, because it's kind of like, do you start to kind of build an actual structure? Do you start to have office space? Do you start to have staff? Do you start to have a policy agenda and things like that? Because I think it's at this kind of point where, okay, we've gotten out in the streets, we've made some noise, we're getting some eyeballs and clicks, but like, what do we do with this? So part of my interest in this is just looking at them as kind of a movement. But, I do think that it will start to tug a little bit on some of the suburban vote. And then it's a question of kind of what happens between now and the election. For example, one of the sub-narratives of all this is these kind of racist feeder fish characters that kind of hover around these situations. The umbrella guy who was bashing windows, or this kid who shot people. Because what we could end up with is not just a BLM narrative going into the fall, but another BLM protest with another lonely white loser who shot a bunch of people. So it could even then metastasize beyond just a simple BLM thing.
Oh, it's kind of where we are right now. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's definitely going to get pushed just by kind of the market forces of the national conversation into roughly the same thing. And then the last point is this: there's a calendar component to this, because we always think of like the last 10 days and GOTV. There's people voting almost right now. So a lot of these campaigns have to go out and do this virtual kind of road show. They have to be planning for their closing arguments, and they have to be getting the early vote done and all those other things. So it's a completely jumbled schedule. So all of these things, I think, are factors in this. But I do think no matter what we say here, that it will be a part of the conversation heading in November. There's no doubt.
Well, and Marshall, clearly, the Republicans, the RNC, they've sort of bet on this messaging working for them. But as Roger points out, and you pointed out as well, actually the time when Trump's numbers were the worst was in response to his poor handling of the protests the last time that we had a surge of riots across the country. So it's not guaranteed that he's going to handle it in a way that's going to make people feel better, because I think the sense was at that time, you're not helping, you're actually creating more chaos. You're making it less safe. You're adding to the level of chaos and violence in the streets. So to me, the assumption that, more chaos, more violence in the streets is actually going to inure to Trump's benefit, that isn't actually what we've seen thus far in this campaign.
Depends on his response. I 100% agree with that. Because if President Trump decides to make this all about him, so if he makes it all about him walking through Lafayette Square with the Bible, and then the tear gassing, and then the protests, and then the protests become not about George Floyd, but they become about Trump, that's where the disaster happens. Because that creates a scenario where then Democratic governors and mayors then make it all about Trump as well, too. And that's where the disaster happens. Trump will be at his best if his response to this is just to frankly engage positively with the idea that what happened to, Jacob Blake wasn't good, and then focus on, and that's why it's good to have Ben Carson recognize that and sort of talk about that during the convention, but then focus on the fact that why is the response to that the fact that, you have small businesses on fire during COVID. Separate the protesters. For example, there's a march on Washington today. President Trump has no beef with those protesters when it comes to sort of like that act. Like, that's civic duty. It's the anniversary of the March on Washington. Engaging negatively on that is exactly the wrong thing to do. What he should be doing, frankly, is stepping back and giving governors and mayors the space to deal with the actual looting and the actual violence and the actual protests at night after curfew that have nothing to do with protecting anyone's lives and actually helping our culture deal with the really tough racial issues in this country.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Roger, just last thing on this before I get to you. I think what it is that when Trump did Lafayette Square, people always assume chaos helps Trump. But if people blame him for the chaos, then it's obviously not going to help him. I have to notice, he hasn't said a word about what's happening beyond that there should be law and order. And, from what I can tell, everything seems to be trending up his way. And so, Roger, maybe based on your experience also in the Obama administration, that kind of seemed the way that Barack Obama was able to hold such high approval ratings even during moments like Ferguson and Charlotte, which all happened under his administration, which is he would condemn rioting, he would give full support to law enforcement, and also express positivity for the idea itself. What do you think?
Yeah, one of the main differences between these individuals, and we could fill up multiple shows shining a light on those, was that President Obama was willing to listen to his staff when they would say, let's make a strong statement and then let's focus on the rest of our agenda, and you need to lay low on this for a couple of days or whatever the instructions may be. He would do that. And to touch on Marshall's point a little bit, there's this insatiable need on the part of the president to be this kind of cultural arsonist. I always think of this kind of metaphor, which is my house is on fire, and I say to myself, oh, well, great. My next door neighbor happens to be the mayor. Maybe I'll get like a little faster response from the fire and the police and things like that. And the mayor walks over while my house is on fire and says, your kids are stupid. Your wife is fat. Right. And you're just like, yeah, but my house is on fire. Like, how is this helpful? But when he sees these windows, he can't help himself, and it's a very kind of Nixonian way in that when he sees the opportunity to drive a wedge, as opposed to lead, which I think was ultimately what Marshall's point was if he just leads in these things and doesn't get into the name calling and the disparaging of certain groups and kind of trivializing the whole thing or rendering it into some kind of a cartoon, he could actually come out of this for the better. Or in another way, his numbers go up when he's not in the news. So if he could just take the Obama model, make a strong statement, support both sides, call for calm and safety, and then recede from the news cycle for 48 hours, he would be in a much better and different situation than he is right now.
I couldn't agree with you more on that one. All right.
Guys, great to see both of you.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Have a great day, Roger. And we'll have more Rising for you after this.